The lantern light caught the tears on Abigail Shepard's face before Wallace Monroe even saw her standing in the doorway of his ranch house, her doctor's bag open on the table, its contents spilled out like a confession she had never intended to make. The laudanum bottles, the surgical instruments wrapped in clean linen, the folded letter with the Philadelphia return address, all of it laid bare under the flickering yellow glow of the kerosene lamp. She had not meant for him to come back early. She had not meant for any of it to happen this way. Wallace stood in the threshold with mud on his boots and a dying calf over his shoulders, and he looked at the bag and he looked at her, and something in his dark eyes shifted from confusion into something far more dangerous. Recognition. The kind that does not come from knowing a person long, but from knowing the shape of a secret when you see one. "You were looking for something," he said. It was not a question. Abigail did not move. Her hands were trembling and she pressed them flat against the wooden surface of the table, and she thought about the lie she had rehearsed on every mile of the train from Philadelphia to Kansas, across the flat burnt plains of Missouri, through the choking dust of the cattle towns. She had rehearsed it so many times that it had started to feel almost like truth. Almost. "I was not looking," she said. "I was trying to hide." He set the calf down on the porch without looking away from her. He stepped inside and closed the door with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that whatever came next would change everything. He looked at the letter with its broken seal. He looked at the bottles. He looked at her, this woman he had known for exactly 43 days, this woman who had arrived on his land under the guise of being a traveling physician, responding to an advertisement for medical services in the territory of Kansas. This woman who had stitched up his ranch hands and set a broken arm and pulled 2 back teeth, and who had never once asked him for a single thing he had not already been willing to give. "You want to tell me what's in that letter?" he said. And Abigail Shepard, who had survived medical school by pretending to be her dead brother, who had fled Philadelphia because a powerful man wanted her silenced, who had come west with nothing but a doctor's bag and a secret that could destroy her, looked at Wallace Monroe and made the only decision that had ever truly felt honest. She told him everything. But to understand what everything meant, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the day she stepped off the westbound train at the little depot in Hargrove, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, with dust in her hair and iron in her spine. The Kansas plains in May were not beautiful in the way that Eastern magazines described them. They were vast and indifferent, and they smelled of cattle and dry earth and something electrical that lived permanently in the sky. Abigail had grown up reading about the frontier in Harper's Weekly, and she had imagined something romantic, something golden. What she found instead was a town of perhaps 300 souls, a single unpainted general store, a saloon with a broken window that no one had bothered to fix, and a mud street that the locals referred to with some irony as Main Avenue. She had a carpetbag in one hand and her leather doctor's bag in the other, and she wore a brown traveling dress that had seen better decades, and she was 27 years old and running out of time. The advertisement she had answered had been pinned to a board at the Philadelphia train station, already 3 weeks old when she found it. It said that the Hargrove Township and surrounding ranchlands were in need of a physician, as their previous doctor had retired to St. Louis on account of his nerves. It offered a modest monthly fee from a collective of local ranchers and the use of a small building behind the livery as a clinic. It had been placed by a man named G. Monroe of the Monroe Cattle Operation, 16 miles north of Hargrove. Abigail had answered it under the name A. Shepard, M.D., and had not clarified the first initial beyond that, because she had learned through long and painful experience that the world received a woman doctor the way it received a thunderstorm, with suspicion, and then with reluctant gratitude and sometimes with fury. She had not imagined she would stay long. She had imagined she would make enough money to get to California, far enough from Philadelphia that James Hartwell could not reach her. That was all she had wanted, enough distance, enough time. a place where the name Hartwell did not make men go quiet at dinner tables. But Hargrove had a way of making plans irrelevant. The man who met her at the depot was not Wallace Monroe. He was a raw-boned, sunburned young man named Pete Calloway who worked on the Monroe ranch, and he took her bags without comment and loaded them into a buckboard wagon and said, almost apologetically, that Mr. Monroe had meant to come himself, but there was a problem with the river crossing on the north pasture, and once Mr. Monroe got a problem in his head, he tended to stay with it until it was solved. "What manner of man is Mr. Monroe?" Abigail asked, because she liked to know things in advance. Pete Calloway thought about this with genuine effort. "He's the kind of man," he said finally, "who will argue with you all morning and then do exactly what you suggested in the first place without admitting that he changed his mind." "A stubborn man," she said. "The stubbornest," Pete agreed, with what sounded like deep affection. The Monroe Ranch was called the Double M, and it was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. The main house was a two-story structure of weathered limestone with a wide porch that ran the full length of the front face, and the outbuildings were clean and well kept, and the cattle in the south pasture were fat and healthy, and everything about the place suggested a man who worked without stopping and expected the same of everything around him. There were 6 ranch hands living in the bunkhouse, a cook named Hector Garcia who ran the kitchen with the authority of a Spanish general, and a foreman named Tom Briggs who had been with the Monroe family since before Wallace was born. Wallace Monroe himself appeared at the end of her first day. When Abigail had already settled her things into the small room, Tom Briggs had shown her off the main hallway, and had already examined the clinic space behind the livery in town, and made a list of what she needed, and had already set the broken wrist of a 12-year-old named Danny Hargrove, who was the nephew of the town founder and had fallen from a hay loft. Wallace came in through the front door, and he was taller than she had expected, lean in the way of men who never stop moving, with dark brown hair that wanted to curl at the temples and that he kept close-cropped to prevent it. He had dark eyes and a jaw that could have been carved, and he wore the dust and sweat of an outdoor day with the unself-consciousness of a man who had long since stopped noticing it. He was 32 years old, and he carried the particular solitude of someone who had learned early that most people leave. He looked at Abigail in the hallway of his own house, and he said, "You're the doctor." "I am," she said. "I expected someone older," he said. "I imagine you expected someone male as well," she said. A pause, something shifted in his expression that she could not immediately name. "I put A. Shepard in the advertisement," he said. "I didn't assume." Which was such an unexpectedly honest answer that Abigail was briefly disarmed. "Most men assume," she said. "I've noticed that most men are often wrong," he said, and went to find Hector about dinner. That was how it began, not with dramatics, not with conflict, with a quiet, careful acknowledgement that here were 2 people who intended to be straight with each other, or at least intended to try. The first 2 weeks were professional and measured. Abigail treated ranch hands for the usual catalog of frontier ailments: a hand infection from a wire cut, a badly burned arm from a campfire accident, a case of severe dysentery that required 3 days of careful nursing. She rode into Hargrove every other day to hold clinic hours in the little building behind the livery, and the town came to her with the mixture of skepticism and desperation that defined frontier medicine. They did not always believe she knew what she was doing. They always needed her to do it anyway. Wallace stayed out of her way with the precise deliberateness of a man maintaining a careful distance. He was never rude. He was always present at meals, which Hector Garcia served in the big kitchen with enough food for twice the number of people at the table, and Wallace would ask her in the evenings how the clinic had gone, and she would tell him, and he would listen with a quality of attention that she had rarely encountered in men who had not chosen medicine themselves. "You listen differently than most people," she told him one evening, about a week and a half in, when they were sitting on the porch after dinner watching a thunderstorm gather on the western horizon. "My father was sick for a long time before he died," he said. "I spent a lot of years listening to doctors describe things I didn't understand, and I decided that the problem was they talked too fast and listened too slow. I decided I would try to do it the other way around." "When did your father die?" she asked. "6 years ago. Left me the ranch and a debt the size of a cattle drive and the absolute conviction that working harder than I had ever worked before was the only possible response." He looked at her sideways. "You lose people, family." She had lost her brother Thomas. She had lost her mother when she was 8 years old. She had lost the version of herself that had believed in the essential goodness of men with power. But she said only, "My brother, 3 years ago," which was true and was also the beginning of the story she was not yet ready to tell. "I'm sorry," Wallace said, and he meant it in the way that people mean it when they have sat with grief themselves and know that words are mostly inadequate but the trying matters. The thunderstorm broke over the plains with a sound like artillery, and they sat on the porch and watched it come, and neither of them moved inside. And when the rain finally reached the ranch house, it came sideways and cold, and they retreated to the doorway but not fully inside, and stood close enough that Abigail could smell the cedar and leather of him. And she thought, carefully, and with the part of her brain that was always making clinical assessments, that she was in danger of an entirely different kind than the one she had come west to escape. It was in the 3rd week that the first letter arrived. She knew what it was before she opened it. She knew the handwriting on the envelope. James Hartwell had a distinctive hand, all sharp angles and upward pressure, the writing of a man who approached paper the way he approached everything, with force. She did not know how he had found her. She had been so careful. She had used only her initials in the advertisement, had given no forwarding address when she left Philadelphia, had told no one except her one friend Clara Webb where she was going, and Clara would never have told. But Hartwell had money, and Hartwell had connections, and Hartwell had the specific determination of a man who believed that a woman knowing things he did not want known was an emergency that required his full attention. The letter was short. It said, "You know what you have and you know what I want. Come home and return it and we can be done with this. Stay away and I will find you and the matter will be concluded less pleasantly. Your servant, J. Hartwell." She burned it in the kitchen stove while Hector Garcia pretended to be very interested in his flour sacks. What Hartwell wanted was a letter, not the one he had written to her, a different one. A letter that her brother Thomas had written to her 3 months before he died. A letter in which he described, in a physician's precise and damning language, exactly what James Hartwell had done in his capacity as the senior partner of the Hartwell Medical Company of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Thomas Shepard had been a physician too, trained at the University of Pennsylvania, and he had worked for 3 years in Hartwell's company. And he had discovered things that Hartwell was doing with the medicines he manufactured and sold across the eastern seaboard, cutting them with substances that were cheaper and sometimes toxic, labeling bottles with one concentration and filling them with another, sending shipments to southern and frontier markets that he would never have dared sell in Philadelphia because those markets had fewer eyes watching. Men had died. Women had died. Children had died, taking medicines that were supposed to help them, and that instead contained enough arsenic or mercury to tip the balance the wrong way. Thomas had written it all down in careful detail with dates and quantities and names, and he had mailed the letter to Abigail because she was the only person he trusted. And then 3 weeks later he had died, officially of a fever, unofficially in circumstances that Abigail had examined with a physician's eye, and could not fully explain to her own satisfaction. She had been at his bedside. She had seen the progression of his illness. It had not looked like fever. It had looked like something she had only read about in toxicology texts. And she had taken the letter and his notes, and she had gone to a lawyer in Philadelphia, and the lawyer had told her that a woman could not bring a case against James Hartwell without male sponsorship, and that he, personally, had a good relationship with the Hartwell family, and could not in good conscience take the matter up. And she had gone to a second lawyer and been told something similar. And she had gone to the Philadelphia Medical Board and been reminded that she had completed her training under a fiction, that her degree was issued to Thomas A. Shepard and not to Abigail M. Shepard, and that pressing this matter might result in an investigation of her own credentials. So she had come west, with a doctor's bag and a secret, and the letter folded very small and hidden in the inner lining of the bag itself, behind the stitched panel that she had opened with a seam ripper and then resewn herself on the train. She had thought she was safe. She had thought the distance was enough. The second letter from Hartwell came 2 weeks after the first, and it was less polite. It said that he had sent a man west to facilitate the return of the stolen material, and that the man had instructions to be persuasive, and that Abigail would be wise to make his job easy. She burned this one too, and she began sleeping with Thomas's old revolver under her mattress, a Colt single-action army that Thomas had purchased on a trip to St. Louis, and that she had learned to fire with some accuracy at a shooting range in Philadelphia, run by a woman named Bess Carter who believed strongly in women being able to defend themselves. Abigail was not a natural shot, but she was a determined one, and determination, she had found, counted for quite a lot. Wallace noticed the change in her before she told him there was anything to notice. He was perceptive in the particular way of men who spend their lives reading weather and animals and the subtle signals of the land trained to spot things that deviated from the pattern. He noticed that she checked the windows at night. He noticed that she tensed at the sound of riders coming down the road. He noticed that her appetite, which had been healthy and frank in the way of a woman who worked hard and was not ashamed of it, had diminished in a way that tracking physicians might call early-stage anxiety response. He did not ask her about it directly. Not yet. He gave her space the way he gave his horses space when they were spook-steady presents, no sudden movements, room to come to him on her own terms. What he did instead was begin to appear, more often and less coincidentally, in the spaces where she might need someone to be. He was on the porch when she came home late from a clinic day in Hargrove. He was at breakfast earlier than usual on the mornings when she seemed to have slept badly. He found reasons to be working in the yard when she walked to the stable for her horse. He thought he was being subtle. He was not particularly, but it did not matter because what Abigail felt when she noticed was not irritation, but something quieter and more treacherous. Something she had not felt in a very long time and had largely given up expecting to feel again. She had loved a man once in Philadelphia during her medical training. His name was David Marsh, and he had been a fellow student, and he had known she was a woman and had been supportive and warm, and then, when it became clear that her continued presence in the program was drawing attention that might jeopardize his own career, he had gone to the dean and told him what she was. She had been expelled for 1 semester before being reinstated through the intervention of a sympathetic professor, but David Marsh had looked at her after and said he was sorry, and she had seen in his eyes that he was not sorry enough, that he would do it again, and she had understood something hard and necessary about the difference between men who said they believed in something and men who actually did. Wallace Monroe, she was beginning to suspect, was one of the ones who actually did. On a Tuesday in the 4th week, one of his ranch hands named Bo Tucker fell off a horse and hit his head on a fence post and was unconscious for 11 minutes, which was long enough for everyone present to be very frightened indeed. Abigail was there. She had come out to the south pasture to look at a heifer that Tom Briggs thought might be developing an infected hoof, and she knelt in the dry grass beside Bo Tucker and monitored his breathing and his pupils and kept perfectly calm while around her everyone else was not. Wallace was there. He crouched beside her and watched her work with an expression she had not seen on him before, something raw and unguarded that he had not had time to put away before she caught it. Bo Tucker came around, confused and embarrassed, and Abigail helped him to the bunkhouse and made sure he stayed awake and watched. And after an hour she was confident he had not sustained permanent damage, only a splitting headache and a bruise the size of a dinner plate. Wallace found her afterward in the small tack room off the stable where she was cleaning her instruments. "Thank you," he said from the doorway. "It is what I am here for," she said. "I know that's true," he said. "But the way you were with him, the way you kept everyone calm, you did not have to do that part. That's not in the medical catalog." She looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe, and the afternoon light came through the single small window and caught the dust in the air between them, and it was one of those moments that exist outside of ordinary time, where everything seems to have slowed to the speed of honesty. "I've been doing this a long time," she said. "Medicine teaches you that fear is usually the thing that does the most damage. If you can manage the fear, the body has a better chance." "Where did you train?" he said, and there it was, the question. The one she had been waiting for someone to ask in the way that required a real answer. She could have deflected. She had deflected it before, in polite company, with the vague answer that covered the complicated truth. "I trained in Philadelphia. I completed my studies there. I have been practicing for 4 years." All true, all incomplete. "The University of Pennsylvania," she said. "I completed my studies under my brother's name, because the school did not admit women to the full program, and I had already spent 2 years there before they realized I was not who my paperwork said I was. And by then, I had won enough respect from the faculty that they looked the other way." She did not know why she told him that. She had not planned to. It came out because the tack room was quiet and he was listening, and the careful shell she had built around the truth had developed, without her noticing, a crack precisely the size of Wallace Monroe's attention. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of disapproval, the quiet of a man absorbing something honestly. "Did you pass?" he asked. She blinked. "Did I pass? The examinations, did you pass them?" "With the highest marks in my year," she said, a little fiercely. "Then the school educated a doctor," he said, "regardless of whatever name was on the paper." It was such a simple thing to say. Such an uncomplicated, decent thing. She felt something in her chest that she recognized, with some alarm, as the specific tenderness that precedes falling in love. "That is not the general opinion on the matter," she said. "I'm not particularly interested in general opinions," he said. She believed him. That was the thing. She looked at this man in his dusty boots and his work-worn shirt, and she believed him completely. She was in considerable danger. The man Hartwell had sent arrived in Hargrove on a Friday in the 5th week, and his name was Carl Rudd, and he was not the kind of man who arrived quietly. He came into town on a big gray horse with a new saddle that looked expensive against the rest of him, which was not expensive at all, and he went into the saloon first, which Abigail observed from the window of her clinic, and then he went to the general store, and she saw him speaking to the storekeeper with the posture of a man who was asking questions and expected answers. She finished her clinic hours and rode back to the Double M with the cold certainty of someone who has been running and has just heard footsteps. She told herself she would leave. She told herself she would pack tonight and be on the southbound stage to Dodge City by morning, and from there to the railroad, and from there to wherever Hartwell's reach did not extend, which might be California or might be nowhere at all, because men like Hartwell had a tendency to extend further than you expected. She went to dinner instead, because Hector had made tamales and a green chili stew that smelled extraordinary, and because sitting at that table with Wallace Monroe and Pete Calloway and old Tom Briggs and the other hands had become, in 5 weeks, something she did not want to give up. Wallace watched her through dinner and said nothing, but when the others had gone and Hector was washing up in the kitchen, he poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and set one in front of her and sat down across the table. "Something happened today," he said. She wrapped her hands around the cup. The coffee was dark and strong, the way Hector made it, the way she had come to love it. "A man came to Hargrove," she said. "He was asking questions. He works for someone in Philadelphia who wants something I have." Wallace was very still. "Are you in danger?" "I might be," she said. "I should probably go." "Where? California or farther?" "I have been trying to figure out how far is far enough." He looked at her for a long moment. What does he want? And she was going to say something partial, something that covered the shape of the truth without its full weight, but she looked at his face in the lamplight, and she thought about David Marsh and every man who had made her calculate what to reveal based on what it would cost her, and she thought about what it would feel like to be straight with someone for once, just to see what happened. "A letter," she said. "My brother wrote it before he died. It describes criminal activity by a very wealthy and influential man in Philadelphia. It implicates him in practices that have killed people. I have the letter. The man wants it back because it would destroy him." Wallace's expression did not change in any dramatic way. It was the expression of a man listening to the full weight of something. "Your brother," he said, "the one who died 3 years ago." "Yes. You think his death was related. I cannot prove it, but I'm a physician and I observed his final illness and I have questions I cannot fully answer." Silence. The stove ticked. Somewhere outside a coyote made its lonely sound. "The letter is here," he said. "In my bag, in the lining." She paused. "I have been hiding it since I arrived. I want you to know that. I want you to know that I came to this position under false pretenses, at least partially, and that I put your household at potential risk by bringing this here, and I am—" She stopped. Her voice had done something she had not given it permission to do, developed an unsteadiness. "I am sorry for that. You came here to practice medicine," he said. "You have done that. Whatever you're carrying is not my business unless you choose to make it my business." "It has become your business," she said. "This man Carl Rudd will come here. If he found out where I am, which given that he was asking questions in Hargrove he clearly has or will soon, he will come to the double M. Then we will receive him," Wallace said, with a calm flatness that she found unexpectedly reassuring, "and we will see what he has to say for himself. He is not the kind of man who says things," she said. "He is the kind of man who does them." "So am I," said Wallace Monroe, and refilled her coffee. She did not leave for California. She had told herself she would, and then she had not. And when she thought about it honestly, she knew it was not only because of the tamales or the coffee or the warmth of the kitchen. It was because somewhere in the preceding weeks, Wallace Monroe had become something she had not had since Thomas died, which was a person in whose presence she felt less like she was managing a performance, and more like she was simply herself. She finished stitching the cut on Bo Tucker's hand. He had managed to injure himself again, this time with a fence staple. And she sat on the bunkhouse steps in the late afternoon sun, and she thought about what it would mean to stop running. Carl Rudd came to the Double M on a Saturday morning, 2 days after his arrival in Hargrove. He came alone, which surprised her, because she had expected him to bring company. He rode up the long road to the ranch house and dismounted with the affected ease of a man who wants you to know he is not worried about you, which always meant, in Abigail's experience, that he was worried about something. Wallace was on the porch. He had known from the sound of the horse that someone was coming, and he had come out and stood with his coffee cup and the particular stillness of a man who has decided to let the situation come to him. Abigail was in the doorway behind him. She had the Colt in her right hand, held behind her thigh where it was not visible from the yard. "I'm looking for a woman named Abigail Shepard," Carl Rudd said, "traveling physician. I was told she's staying here." "You were told right," Wallace said. "What's your business with her?" Rudd looked past Wallace toward the doorway, and his eyes found Abigail, and something moved across his face, the professional satisfaction of a man who has been chasing something and found it. "My business is private," he said, "between me and Miss Shepard." "I don't think it is," Wallace said pleasantly. "I think when a man rides onto a person's property with intentions towards someone living on that property, it becomes the property owner's business, wouldn't you say?" Rudd shifted in his saddle. His hand moved toward his coat, and then stopped when he saw that Wallace had, with the economy of a man who has done this many times in many forms, set down his coffee cup and placed his right hand at his hip in the vicinity of the revolver on his belt. Mr. Hartwell wants what belongs to him, Rudd said. Letters that my brother wrote to me do not belong to James Hartwell, Abigail said from the doorway, stepping out far enough to be clearly seen. They belong to me. They were written to me. Your brother took property of Mr. Hartwell's, records from the business. My brother observed illegal practices in the course of his employment and documented them for his own protection, she said. That is not theft. That is evidence. Rudd's jaw tightened. Mr. Hartwell has a different view of the matter. I imagine he does, she said. Men who poison medicine tend to have interesting views about the people who notice. The word poison landed in the yard like a stone thrown into still water. Rudd's face went through several things in quick succession. She had said it clearly and without hesitation, and she had said it loudly enough that Pete Calloway and Tom Briggs, who had come around the corner of the bunkhouse with no particular urgency, could hear it. You have no proof of anything, Rudd said. I have a very detailed letter, she said. And I have been keeping very careful notes of my own on your employer's business practices and their effects in the territories, because as a physician I have treated people out here who have been harmed by medications that your employer sold as something other than what they were. I have names and dates and observations that would add considerably to what my brother documented. That was not entirely true. She had treated one man in Hargrove who had come in with symptoms that had looked odd, and she had noted it, but she had not yet made the full connection to Hartwell's products. However, she had been thinking about it, and the fact that she was willing to say it out loud in the dirt yard of a Kansas ranch told her something about herself she had not previously known with certainty. She was not going to run anymore. Carl Rudd looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Wallace. He looked at Tom Briggs and Pete Calloway. He was one man and he was on a horse and he had ridden onto a working cattle ranch, and the mathematics of the situation had become unfavorable. Mr. Hartwell will pursue this, he said. He is welcome to try, Wallace said. And if he sends anyone to this ranch or to the town of Hargrove with the intention of interfering with Dr. Shepard or her patients, I will take that as a matter requiring the attention of the federal marshal at Dodge City, who is a personal acquaintance of mine, and we will see what he makes of it. Rudd turned his horse and rode back down the road and did not look back. The yard was quiet. Abigail became aware that her right hand was still holding the Colt, and that her left hand was gripping the porch post, and that she was shaking. The fine internal shaking of someone whose body has spent the last 5 minutes on the edge of violence and is now releasing the tension of that. Wallace came to her side and very gently took the revolver out of her hand and set it on the porch railing, and then, with equal care and no fanfare, put his hand over her left hand where it gripped the post. He did not say anything. He did not need to. His hand was warm and steady, and she let herself lean against the post and breathe, and after a moment the shaking stopped. I meant it about the federal marshal, he said quietly. I know you did, she said. My acquaintance with him is somewhat exaggerated, but not entirely. I thought so, she said, and she laughed, which surprised both of them. He laughed too, a brief real sound that she realized she had not heard from him before, a full laugh, unguarded, the laugh of a man who is caught off guard by genuine delight. It was a wonderful laugh, and she stored it away carefully. He kept his hand over hers for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for comfort, and then he retrieved his coffee cup from the railing and said, in the tone of a man returning to the practical, Rudd will report back. Hartwell will have to decide if he wants to escalate. What's your assessment? He might, she said, or he might calculate the risk. What I said about federal attention is real. He has enemies in Washington. He will not want the scrutiny. And the letter, she looked at him. I need to get it to someone who can use it, a journalist possibly, or a federal prosecutor. If it is published or used in official proceedings, Hartwell loses his leverage. There is nothing to gain from coming after me if the information is already out. Do you know anyone in that line? She hesitated. There is a man in Topeka. A newspaper editor named Harrison Ford, not a common name, but it is his. who has been writing about patent medicine fraud for 2 years. If I could get the letter to him, and if I could get my own observations to him. Topeka is 4 days by stage, Wallace said. Or 2 days on horseback for someone who can ride. I can ride, she said. I know you can, he said. I've watched you. A pause. I'll go with you. She turned to look at him directly. He was looking at the horizon in the particular way he had when he was committing to something. You have a ranch to run, she said. Tom can run the ranch for a week. He's done it before. He looked at her. You have been carrying this alone for a long time, Dr. Shepard. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. She did not say anything for a moment, because her throat had done the thing it was not supposed to do. She looked at the flat Kansas sky and the long sweep of grass and the distant cattle and this ranch that had become, without her planning it, something very close to home. Why? She said. Not in the way of someone who doubted him, but in the way of someone who needed to understand. He was quiet for a moment that was thoughtful rather than evasive. Because you are the best person I have met in a very long time, he said simply. And because what happened to your brother and what Hartwell is doing are wrong. And I was raised to believe that knowing something is wrong and doing nothing about it because it is inconvenient is a form of participation in the wrongness. He paused. And because I would rather not think about you riding to Topeka alone with Carl Rudd somewhere behind you on that road. It was not a declaration. It was not a romantic speech. It was something more honest than either of those things, and it went through her with the particular warmth of truth recognized. I would rather not think about it either, she admitted. They rode to Topeka 3 days later, taking the longer route north through the grasslands because Tom Briggs said it was safer for 2 riders to keep to the open country where you could see approach. And Tom Briggs had been navigating Kansas for 30 years, and his advice was worth having. The first day was professional. They rode and talked about medicine, about ranching, about the territory and its political situation. Kansas had been a state for 20 years by then, but its northern counties still had the feel of the frontier. The federal presence was thin, and the land was working its way toward civilization with the grinding slowness of a genuinely large thing trying to move. They stopped at a settler family's homestead for water, and Abigail looked at the wife's hands and recognized early signs of a nutritional deficiency, and left them with a quantity of dried beef and advice about leafy plants. And Wallace watched her with the attention he always brought to watching her, and she felt it on the back of her neck the whole time. That night, they made camp by a creek bend. Wallace built a fire with the efficiency of someone who has done it 1,000 times in all conditions, and Abigail laid out the camp equipment from the saddle packs with equal efficiency, and they ate cornbread and dried meat from Hector's packed provisions and drank from the creek through a clean cloth and watched the fire. The stars in Kansas were staggering. She had read about this too in the Eastern magazines and had not believed it. But the truth was that without the light and smoke of a city, the sky was a thing of almost shocking abundance, packed with light on light on light. And she lay on her back in the short grass and looked up at it and felt, for the first time in years, something uncomplicated. My brother used to say that every star is a different kind of argument for believing the universe is larger than our problems, she said. Wallace was lying a few feet away on his own bedroll, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He sounds like he was worth knowing." "He was the best person I knew," she said. "He was better at being kind than I am. I have always been sharper. Thomas was the one who could make anyone feel seen." She paused. "I used to think that was the difference between us and that it was a permanent difference. But I have been thinking recently that maybe kindness is something you can learn if you find the right models for it." A silence. The fire crackled. Somewhere a great horned owl asked its question into the dark. "What changed your thinking on that?" Wallace said. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the stars, and she thought about a man who poured coffee without being asked and put his hand over hers in the yard, and said you do not have to carry it alone, and asked every morning how the clinic had gone with the genuine interest of someone who finds people interesting. "The right model," she said. Another silence. In it, something settled between them like a hand laid gently and without pressure on a table. "Abigail," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the title, and she felt it like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. "Wallace," she said, "when this is finished. When the letter is where it needs to be and Hartwell doesn't have the leverage anymore." He stopped, started again. I am asking clearly, not presuming. I would like to know if you intend to stay in Kansas." "I have been thinking about that," she said, "and I have been thinking that a woman can get used to stars like these," she said, "and to coffee made properly, and to patients who actually need her." "And other things," he said. "And other things," she confirmed. The fire died down, and the stars wheeled overhead, and they slept on the opposite sides of a careful and respectful fire. And in the morning they rode north toward Topeka, and the second day had a different quality to it. The particular ease of people who have said something important obliquely and understood each other completely, and are now carrying it together. Harrison Ford of the Topeka Daily Commonwealth was a small, energetic man with ink-stained fingers and the suspicious eyes of someone who had been given false information many times and had stopped taking anything at face value. He took the letter from Abigail with a care that suggested he understood its weight, and he read it twice slowly. And then he read the supplementary notes she had added in the preceding weeks, the cases she had treated in Hargrove, the medication irregularities she had documented, the names and dates she had been able to assemble, and he set it all down on his cluttered desk and looked at her. "This is significant," he said. "I know it is," she said. "Do you understand what will happen if I publish it? Hartwell will come after this paper. He has the resources for a protracted legal fight." "I know that too," she said. "Do you have the resources to withstand it?" He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who has been waiting for exactly this kind of fight. "The Commonwealth has a backer who dislikes Hartwell considerably, a beef processing man from Chicago who had a bad experience with Hartwell's business practices 3 years ago and has been looking for an appropriate moment." He looked at the papers again. "This is the appropriate moment. I need assurance that the original letter will be preserved safely," she said, "and copies made." "I will have 3 copies made today," he said, "and I will send one to the Philadelphia Inquirer and one to the New York Tribune and one to the Associated Press." He looked at her with a journalist's frank assessment. "You understand this will put your name in the papers, a woman physician. There will be people who—" "I am aware of what people will say," she said. "I have been aware of it since medical school. Say my name correctly. Abigail Shepard, M.D., and say that my brother Thomas Shepard, M.D., died in circumstances that warrant investigation." He wrote it down. They were in Topeka for 2 days while Ford made his copies and Abigail gave a formal statement to a federal land attorney who had been in the building across from the newspaper for reasons entirely unrelated to them, but who, when he heard the nature of the matter, sat down with the serious expression of someone who recognizes a matter within his purview. Wallace stayed through all of it. He sat in the background of the newspaper office and the attorney's office and said nothing that was not asked of him, which was its own form of the support of a solid and uncomplicated presence that asked nothing in return. On the second evening in Topeka, they had dinner at a restaurant, an actual restaurant with tablecloths and a menu written on a board, which felt almost absurdly civilized compared to the weeks preceding it. Abigail wore the same brown traveling dress, which she had brushed clean, and Wallace wore a clean shirt, and they sat across from each other at a table in a Kansas restaurant in the spring of 1882 and ate beef stew with fresh bread, and the feeling between them was the feeling of something that had been building for a long time and was reaching the point of natural arrival. "What did you want to be," she said, "when you were young enough to want things uncomplicated by reality?" He considered this. "I wanted to train horses," he said. "I wanted to understand them so well that I could fix the ones that had been frightened or damaged. I still do that when I have time. It's why I'm slower to sell the difficult ones." "You keep the difficult ones," she said. The difficult ones have the most to offer usually, he said. Once they decide to trust you. She looked at him. He was looking at his bread. She thought with a clarity that was almost physical that she had spent 3 years being afraid, and that fear had a specific sensation, a tightness and compression, and that sitting across from this man at this table she felt the opposite of that, an expansion, an opening like a window found in a wall she had thought was solid. "I want to stay in Kansas," she said. He looked up. "I want to stay in Hargrove. I want to keep the clinic. I want—" She stopped. Then continued, because stopping was no longer the version of herself she intended to be. "I want to know you better, for as long as you are willing to be known." He was very still in the way he got very still when something mattered. "I have been trying to find the right moment to say something similar," he said, "without it seeming like I was taking advantage of a difficult situation." "You have not taken advantage of anything," she said. "You gave me a place to land and room to stand and someone to stand with. That is not taking advantage. That is something considerably more valuable." "Abigail," he said, and the way he said her name had weight in it, the weight of a man who does not say things lightly. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table, and she put her hand in his. They rode back to Hargrove in 3 days, taking the same northern route, and the Kansas spring was fully underway now. The grass pale green and the sky enormous and full of moving clouds, and they rode close enough that their horses occasionally touched flanks and talked about everything. His father and the debt and the 6 years of rebuilding the Double M, her medical training and the years of pretending, and the years of fighting and the eventual arrival at a competence so irrefutable that even the skeptical could not entirely dismiss it. Her mother who had died of consumption when Abigail was 8, and her father who had remarried badly, and her brother Thomas, who had been the anchor of her world. She told him about David Marsh because she thought he deserved to know about the precedent. He listened without interrupting. "He was afraid," Wallace said. "That's not an excuse, but it's what he was." "I know," she said. "I'm not angry at him anymore. I was for a long time. Now I mostly feel sorry for him because he gave something up to be afraid, and I don't think he ever stopped knowing it." "What did he give up?" Wallace said. She looked at him sideways from under the brim of her hat. "Someone remarkable," she said, without a trace of vanity, in the same tone she might use to describe a clinical observation. He laughed. That laugh again. She thought she would spend a long time being glad of that laugh. When they came down the road to the Double M, Hector Garcia was on the porch, and he saw them coming and he went inside. And by the time they had unsaddled the horses and come through the kitchen door there was fresh coffee and a plate of sweet bread on the table, and Hector said nothing at all, but he was smiling with the entirety of his face. The weeks after Topeka moved differently. The tightness was gone from Abigail's shoulders, the constant monitoring of roads and riders, the calculation of exits. She heard from Harrison Ford by post 3 weeks later that the story had been published in 4 newspapers, and that the federal attorney's office in Philadelphia had opened an inquiry into the Hartwell Medical Company, and that James Hartwell himself had gone to ground in a way that suggested he had known this day was coming and had been preparing for it. He did not send anyone else to Kansas. She had not thought he would. Men like Hartwell, when the light came on, retreated into legal and financial shadows. They did not do the violent thing when the violent thing would confirm everything being said about them. He would fight with lawyers and money, and she would fight with evidence and witnesses and the federal machinery that had been set into motion. And she was not certain of winning, but she was not running anymore, and that was the point. She expanded the clinic in Hargrove. She hired a young woman named Myra Johnston, who was the daughter of the livery owner and who wanted to learn nursing and who had, Abigail observed quickly, a natural aptitude for the work and a steadiness under pressure that was worth developing. She taught Myra the way her best teachers had taught her, with explanation and patience and the insistence that there were no foolish questions, only questions. She and Wallace moved toward each other with the care of people who are doing something important and know it. He came to town twice a week, which was more than ranch business required, and she came to the Double M for dinner more often than clinic hours necessitated. And they rode together on Sunday afternoons across the grasslands, and they talked and argued and agreed and disagreed, and discovered the full topography of each other's minds. He had strong opinions about water rights and land management. She had strong opinions about public health and the distribution of medical resources in rural communities. They disagreed about the railroad companies and agreed about the necessity of public education, and were fascinated by each other's disagreements in the way of people who are genuinely interested in the other person, rather than just looking for confirmation. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in June, standing on a small rise of ground from which you could see 30 miles of Kansas in every direction. They had been arguing about something neither of them could afterward remember, and he had turned toward her in the middle of a sentence, and the sentence had stopped, and they had looked at each other, and the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of everything had arrived all at once, and he put his hand against her jaw very gently, with the particular gentleness he brought to frightened animals, and kissed her with the serious and complete attention he brought to everything he cared about. She kissed him back with 12 years of medical training, 6 years of fighting, 3 years of grief, and whatever the opposite of grief was called, the thing on the other side of the long dark that she had not believed in for a while and now believed in quite profoundly. When they came apart, they stood in the Kansas wind and looked at each other, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because there was not much to say that would add to what had already been said. "I think," he said, "that I have been in love with you since the tack room." "The tack room was 5 weeks in," she said. "I know I was slow." "You were not slow," she said. "You were patient. There is a difference." He smiled, and it was the smile she had been collecting for weeks, the real one, the one that took over his whole face and had no caution in it. He took her hand, and they stood on the rise and looked at the enormous sky. She thought about the train from Philadelphia. She thought about the advertisement pinned to the board with its corners curling. She thought about arriving in Hargrove with dust in her hair and iron in her spine, and the absolute conviction that she would stay only long enough to get to California. She thought about Thomas, who had said the universe was larger than your problems, and she thought he had been right, not in the way of comfort but in the way of fact. The universe was large enough to contain both the darkness of what Hartwell had done and the brightness of what was happening right now on this particular piece of Kansas earth. "I love you," she said. She had not planned to say it first. But she had also spent 12 years in medicine, where the patient who waited too long to speak sometimes lost the chance, and she had learned to say the important thing when it was true rather than waiting for the perfect moment. He looked at her with an expression she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. "I love you," he said, "very much, in a way that I suspect will not diminish." "I have come to the same conclusion," she said. He laughed and she laughed, and the wind moved through the grass in long silver waves, and Kansas stretched in every direction to the edge of the sky. He proposed on a Thursday in August, not dramatically. They were at breakfast, and Hector had made eggs, and there was fresh coffee, and the morning light was the golden, heavy morning light of late summer, and he looked at her across the table and said, "I want to ask you to marry me, and I want to ask it plainly because I think you prefer plain speaking." "I do prefer plain speaking," she said. "I want to marry you, Abigail. I want you to stay at the Double M as something other than the ranch physician, though I hope you will continue to be the ranch physician because you are excellent at it and we need you. But I want—" He stopped, tried again. "I want my life to be with you. Will you let it be with you?" She put down her coffee cup. She looked at him for a moment with the full force of her attention, which was considerable. "Yes," she said, "I will." Hector Garcia, from behind the stove where he was pretending not to listen, said, finally, in a tone of profound satisfaction. They were married in October 1882 in Hargrove, in the Methodist church that was the only church in town. The minister was a Reverend Caleb Burke who had known Wallace since he was 17 and who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Tom Briggs was best man. Myra Johnston stood up with Abigail, which surprised people and delighted Abigail, who had not had many women friends, and was finding that Myra was becoming one of the good ones. The whole of Hargrove seemed to come. The ranch hands were there in their best clothes with their hair combed, and the town families came, and the settlers from the surrounding homesteads who had been to Abigail's clinic came, including the settler woman with the nutritional deficiency, who was now markedly healthier, and who brought a hand-sewn gift with a note that made Abigail put it quickly into her bag before anyone could see her cry. The ceremony was simple and the words were the traditional ones, and when Reverend Burke asked Wallace Monroe if he took Abigail Shepard to be his wife, Wallace said, "I do," with the exact same directness with which he approached everything in his life. And when he said it, he was looking at her and not at the Reverend. And Abigail said, "I do," with the voice of a woman who has made a decision she is entirely certain of, which was not a voice she had always had access to, and which she intended to use for the rest of her life. Hector made an extraordinary dinner afterward in the church hall, and there was dancing, and Pete Calloway turned out to play the fiddle with considerable skill, and they danced in the wooden hall with the autumn wind outside and the lanterns overhead, and Abigail Monroe, which was now her name, thought that whatever came next she was not facing it alone, and had not been for some time, and would not be again. The Hartwell matter resolved in the spring of 1883. James Hartwell, under investigation by the federal attorney's office, and facing a congressional inquiry that Harrison Ford had helped bring about through sustained and excellent journalism, entered into an agreement with federal authorities in which he surrendered his pharmaceutical license, paid a significant financial settlement to a fund for affected families, and was barred from operating in the medicine trade in any capacity. He was not imprisoned, which was a failure of justice that Abigail documented in a letter to Ford with considerable anger. But his company was dissolved and his influence was ended and the practices he had run were stopped, and that was the thing that mattered most. The practices were stopped. A congressional inquiry specifically cited the letter of Thomas A. Shepard, M.D., and the observations of Abigail Shepard Monroe, M.D., as the primary evidence that initiated the investigation. Thomas's name was in the congressional record. His work had meant something. His death had not been the end of what he had tried to do. Abigail sat with that for a long time. She sat with it on the porch of the Double M in the spring evening light, with the cattle in the south pasture, and the smell of the grass and Hector's cooking coming through the kitchen window, and she felt something in her chest release that she had not realized she had been holding since the day she read Thomas's letter. Wallace found her on the porch and sat beside her, and she told him what she was feeling, in the plain words they had agreed to use with each other, and he listened with the quality of attention that had defined him from the beginning. And when she finished, he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they watched the evening come in across the Kansas plains. "He would have liked you," she said. "I would have liked him," Wallace said. "From everything you've told me, he was the kind of man who should be around longer." "Yes," she said, "he should have been." A silence, but a good silence, the kind that holds things rather than losing them. In the summer of 1883, Abigail found herself in the condition she had theoretically understood since medical school and now understood with the full intimacy of personal experience. She told Wallace on a morning in July when the heat was already considerable, and she had been feeling the first signs of nausea that she recognized from clinical observation, and confirmed with her own thorough self-examination. He went very still in the way he got very still, and then something happened to his face that she had not seen before, a kind of unguarded wonder that made him look younger, and he reached out and took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression that she thought could stop time. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am a physician," she said. "I am as certain as the current state of medical knowledge allows." He laughed. He stood up and pulled her with him and held her with the careful strength of someone who is holding something he knows the value of, and she put her arms around him and felt the solidness of him, The enduring, unmoving solidness of Wallace Monroe, who had looked at a woman with a secret in a doctor's bag and a breaking voice and had simply said, "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." "A child," he said into her hair. "A child," she confirmed. "Tell me everything I need to do," he said. "Tell me everything you need. I will tell you when something is needed," she said. "For the moment, what is needed is exactly this." She meant standing here, held like this, in the summer light of the double M, with Kansas stretching away in every direction, and the future open and full of things she had not known to want. Their son was born in February of 1884, in the bedroom of the double M ranch house, with Myra Johnston assisting and Wallace present because Abigail had told him she wanted him there, and he had not questioned it for a moment. It was a difficult birth, in the way of many first births, long and hard, and requiring all of Abigail's knowledge and Myra's steadiness and Wallace's absolute refusal to be anywhere other than beside his wife. He held her hand through the hardest hours and said nothing useless and nothing false, and when their son arrived, red-faced and furious and entirely correct about the fundamental outrage of being born, Wallace Monroe held his son for the first time with the careful hands of a man who handles living things with full attention, and looked at this new small person with an expression of such complete love that Abigail, exhausted and triumphant, and still putting herself back together on several levels, started to cry. "Stubborn," Myra said with great affection, looking at the baby. "He comes by it honestly," Abigail said, looking at Wallace. They named him Thomas Wallace Monroe, Thomas for the brother who had started everything, Wallace for the man who had made everything possible. Thomas Wallace Monroe arrived in Kansas in February of 1884 and began immediately to make his opinions clear, loudly and without ambiguity, and everyone who knew his parents found this entirely unsurprising. Abigail went back to the clinic 3 months after Thomas was born, because Hargrove needed her, and because she was a physician, and being a physician was not a thing she did so much as a thing she was. Myra Johnston ran the clinic on the days Abigail was at the ranch, and she did it with a growing competence that Abigail recognized as the real thing developing. And she told Myra she should apply to a nursing school, and Myra said she was thinking about it, and Abigail said she would write the strongest possible letter of recommendation. And Myra said that would be very helpful, and then they both went back to work. Wallace expanded the south pasture and bought a new bull from a breeder in Wichita, and the cattle operation grew in the slow, solid way of things built carefully. Tom Briggs retired in 1885, and Pete Calloway became foreman and turned out to be excellent at it, having spent years watching and learning in the particular way of Pete Calloway, who was smarter than he let on and better organized than anyone had given him credit for. In the fall of 1885, Abigail discovered she was carrying a second child. This pregnancy was easier than the first, or perhaps she was simply better at it, or perhaps being easier was what she told herself because she was busier and had less time to attend to her own discomfort. She continued her clinic hours through her 6th month and scaled back in the 7th, and delivered in the spring of 1886 a daughter, as healthy and opinionated as her brother, who had at 2 years old already developed an extremely clear understanding of exactly which things in the world belonged to him. They named her Clara Monroe, for Abigail's friend Clara Webb in Philadelphia, who had been the only person she had told when she left, who had kept the secret, who had written faithfully, and who arrived in person in the summer of 1886 to meet her namesake and stay for 3 weeks, and who fell into immediate and enchanted love with Kansas to the considerable surprise of everyone who knew her as a confirmed city person. Clara Webb sat on the porch of the Double M with a cup of Hector's coffee and looked out at the plains in the evening light and said, "I think I understand why you stayed." "Do you?" Abigail said. "Yes," Clara said. "It's very large here. I mean that in the best way possible. There is room for everything to be what it actually is." Abigail thought that was an excellent description of the thing she had found, not just in Kansas but in this specific life. Room to be what she actually was: a physician, a wife, a mother, a woman who had been afraid for a long time and had come out the other side of the fear into something so much better than she had dared to plan for. Hector Garcia announced in 1887 that he was returning to New Mexico, where his sister and her family lived, and where he wanted to spend the remainder of his working years closer to family. This announcement was received at the Double M with the appropriate degree of sadness and gratitude. There was a dinner in his honor, at which Pete Calloway played fiddle and Thomas Monroe, age 3, sat on Hector's lap and regarded him with the serious dark eyes of a child who senses that something important is happening. And Hector told Wallace and Abigail that this had been the best kitchen he had ever worked and the best household he had ever served. And he said it with the sincerity of a man who does not say things he does not mean. A new cook came, a woman named Dora Finch from Wichita, competent and cheerful and possessed of an excellent pie recipe, and the Double M continued without missing a beat, which was perhaps the best tribute to Hector's years of running the kitchen. He had established a standard that persisted. Wallace taught Thomas to ride on a small, sturdy pony in the summer of 1887, with the patience he brought to all animals and the particular tenderness he reserved for his son. And Abigail watched from the fence with Clara on her hip and felt the specific joy that has no complicated name, the joy of an ordinary morning being exactly what it should be. In the evenings, after the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet, and the stars had come out in their Kansas abundance, she and Wallace sat on the porch and talked or read or said nothing, and the nothing was as full and comfortable as the talking, because they had become the kind of people to each other who did not need to fill the silence, who could inhabit silence together the way you inhabit a house, with ease, with ownership, with the settled knowledge that this is where you belong. She told him once on one of those evenings about the version of herself that had boarded the westbound train in Philadelphia with a doctor's bag and a secret and the intention of reaching California and starting over and never having feelings about anyone again. "That version of you sounds exhausted," he said. "She was," Abigail said. "She was running on pride and anger and not very much else. Pride and anger got her this far," he said. "That's worth something." "They got me here," she said. "The rest was you. The rest was you too," he said. "Don't diminish your own part in it." She considered that. She thought about the clinic, which had grown from one small room behind the livery to a proper 2-room building with a waiting area and a supply room, and which served not just Hargrove but several surrounding townships. She thought about the cases she had treated, and the lives she had touched, and the 2 or 3 young men and women who had written to ask about medical training on her recommendation. She thought about Myra Johnston, who had gone to a nursing school in Topeka and had returned to Hargrove as a credentialed nurse, and who was one of the finest healthcare practitioners in the county by any measure. "All right," she said. "The rest was both of us." "That is the correct answer," he said, and she heard the smile in it. The Federal Record of the Hartwell Inquiry was published in full in 1886 and made several rounds in the medical press, and Abigail received 3 letters from women physicians in other parts of the country who had read her name and her observations and written to express solidarity and gratitude, which she found unexpectedly moving. She wrote back to each of them at length. 2 of those correspondences became ongoing exchanges that lasted for years. The isolation of women in medicine was real, and the antidote to isolation was connection, and she believed in the antidote. A 4th child, another son, was born to Abigail and Wallace Monroe in the spring of 1888. They named him James, not for Hartwell, obviously, but for Wallace's grandfather, James Monroe, who had built the first structure on the Double M land before the Civil War. James Monroe, the younger, arrived loudly and with considerable haste, having decided to make his appearance 3 weeks ahead of schedule, which meant that Abigail delivered her own child with Myra Johnston's steady assistance and Wallace's unshakable presence. And it was fine, because Abigail Monroe was an excellent physician, and Myra Johnston was an excellent nurse, and Wallace Monroe believed in both of them without qualification. Thomas Monroe at 5 looked at his new brother with the expression of someone who has already reached a verdict. "Is he going to make that noise forever?" Thomas asked. "No," Abigail said. "Only for a few months." Thomas considered this. "All right," he said, and went outside to look for his sister, which was approximately his usual response to anything he found temporarily inconvenient. Clara Monroe at 2 was less philosophical and more direct. She sat next to Abigail on the bed and looked at James Monroe and said, "Mine." "Your brother," Abigail said. Clara thought about this. "Mine," she concluded, and that was that. The double M in 1888 was a working, living, expanding thing. The cattle operation was solid. The clinic in Hargrove was established. The ranch house had been expanded by a new wing that Wallace and Pete Calloway had designed and built with help from a carpenter from Dodge City. And the new wing had proper bedrooms for the children and a room that served as Abigail's study, and contained her medical texts and her correspondence files, and a desk where she wrote in the evenings about her clinical observations, writing that she had begun to think might be worth submitting to a medical journal. Because what she had learned in 6 years of frontier medicine was worth knowing, and she saw no reason not to say so. She submitted the first article to the American Journal of Medicine in November of 1888. It was about the management of infection in rural settings where surgical facilities were unavailable. It was accepted with minor revisions and published in the spring of 1889 under the byline Abigail Shepard Monroe, M.D. She received the copy of the journal on a Tuesday morning in April, and she sat at her kitchen table and held it and looked at her name on the page of a medical journal. Her full name, her real name, the name she had been denied the right to use for so many years. And she was very still for a moment, and then she was not crying. She was simply experiencing an intense physiological response to something that mattered very much. Wallace came in from the yard and saw her and came to the table and looked at the journal, and then he sat down beside her. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat like that in the kitchen of the double M with the April sunlight coming through the window and the sound of Thomas and Clara arguing about something in the yard and James making contented sounds from his cradle in the corner. And Abigail Shepard Monroe held her own name in her hands and felt the completeness of a circle closed. She thought about the train. She thought about the dust in her hair and the iron in her spine, and the secret in the lining of her bag and the terror that had masqueraded as determination for 3 years, and the way she had walked into the Hargrove depot without knowing that everything she needed was 16 miles north on a limestone ranch. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him often, and she thought he would have been glad. She thought he would have liked Wallace enormously, and would have gotten into long arguments with him about land use and water rights, and would have won some and lost some, and been better for both. She thought he would have adored the children, who were his namesake and his legacy as much as they were anything else. She thought about his voice, which she could still hear when she concentrated, and the way he had said the universe is larger than your problems, and she thought, yes, Thomas, it is. It is exactly that. The morning went on. The children came in for breakfast. Dora Finch arrived and began making biscuits. Pete Calloway knocked on the door about a fencing question, and Wallace went to answer it. James woke up fully and demanded attention in the absolute manner of a 4-month-old, who has not yet learned to care about anyone's schedule but his own. Thomas came in with mud on his boots and was redirected to the porch to remove them. Clara sat at the table and looked at the journal with her serious dark eyes and asked what it was, and Abigail said, "It is a book of medicine that has my name in it." And Clara nodded with the gravity of someone who finds this entirely appropriate. The morning of the double M went on, as it did, as it would, as it had since the beginning, full of noise and work and difficulty, and the constant, beautiful, ordinary press of living. Abigail Monroe set the journal on the shelf above her desk where she could see it from where she worked, and she went to feed her youngest son. And outside, the window Kansas stretched away to the horizon in every direction, vast and indifferent and entirely beautiful. And the life she had not known to want was exactly the life she was living. And it was, she thought, more than enough. It was everything.